All right, everyone, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling social reforms in India right after they gained independence, from 1947 to 1960.
Okay.
It's a pivotal period, and we've got some really cool sources to help us understand it.
Sounds interesting.
We've got historical texts, of course, but also insights into how the British East India Company's impact lingered, and even a glimpse into the architecture of that era.
Huh.
It's fascinating, right? Trying to see how a nation builds a more equitable society after centuries of colonial rule.
Yeah, it's a period of incredible transformation, full of ambition, but also tons of challenges. I mean, India was stepping out from under British colonialism, trying to deal with these deeply ingrained inequalities.
Right, and I imagine it wasn't just a matter of erasing the past, was it?
Absolutely not. It's surprising, actually, how elements of British rule ended up woven into India's new constitution.
Really? That's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. You're trying to forge a new path while still dealing with the legacy of the past.
Can you give me an example? I'm having trouble picturing that.
Well, think about the Indian Civil Service. It was later renamed the Indian Administrative Service, but it remained this powerful force for stability in newly independent India.
So the bureaucracy basically stayed pretty much intact.
To a large extent, yes. These were people trained in a specific way, steeped in this ethos of impartial governance. They were key in bridging that gap between the colonial past and the hopes for this new nation.
It makes you wonder, what did impartial governance actually look like in practice, especially in a society that's trying to become more equal?
That's a question historians are still debating. Did this system they inherited hinder or help the pursuit of social justice? It's complicated.
Okay, well, let's look at some specific reforms.
Mhm.
Our economic history source mentions the Green Revolution of the late 1960s, when India saw a 26% jump in agricultural production. That's huge.
It was a transformative time, but those benefits, they weren't spread evenly.
Right.
And that takes us right to one of the biggest social reforms of that era, land redistribution.
I was reading about that. Before independence, land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, right? Creating huge disparities.
Exactly.
So land redistribution was meant to empower those landless farmers, the people who'd been excluded for generations.
Exactly. It was a core part of creating a more equitable India.
Yeah.
But, trying to unravel centuries of entrenched land ownership, not easy. There were practical obstacles, legal complexities, and of course, political pressure from those who stood to lose their privilege.
I can only imagine. It
Yep.
sounds like a reform that would be met with a lot of pushback.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine inheriting a system where land ownership was so skewed. How would you go about making it fairer? The challenges were immense, and to be honest, the implementation wasn't perfect.
It makes you think, even with the best of intentions, putting those ideals into practice, it's never straightforward.
No, it isn't.
Did land redistribution actually succeed? Did it reduce inequality in rural India?
It's mixed. In some regions, yes, it helped alleviate poverty, created a more balanced distribution of land. But in other cases, it led to land fragmentation. You end up with these smaller, less productive farms, which sometimes makes things worse.
So it's a story of progress, but also setbacks.
Yeah.
And I imagine that the success of land reform depended on other things too, like education, access to resources, even infrastructure.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It highlights how interconnected these reforms are. They don't happen in a vacuum. They're all tied to so many factors.
Right. Well, speaking of connections, there was something in our source on the history of modern India that I found really striking. It said that in the late 19th century, British policies actually made it harder for Indians to join the Indian civil service. You know, the prestigious one.
Oh, yeah. That's important because it shows how education became a tool for social change. After independence, it became a crucial path to empowerment, especially for those marginalized communities who had been left out.
So it was about more than just basic literacy. It was about, like, opportunity.
Right. Expanding access to education, particularly for those who'd been denied it, it was seen as fundamental to building a more just society.
Are there any, like, specific stories that illustrate this? Something that brings it to life?
Yeah, our source mentions Surendranath Banerjee. He was this brilliant student, but because of those discriminatory policies, he couldn't join the ICS. But he didn't give up. He went on to found the Indian Association, which became a vital platform for advocating for Indian rights.
Wow.
Oh.
That's pretty inspiring. It shows how individual acts of resilience can contribute to big social changes.
Exactly. It reminds us that history isn't just about abstract forces. It's about the actions and choices of real people who challenged the status quo.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, we can't talk about social reform in India without addressing the elephant in the room, the caste system.
Yeah, the caste system. So deeply ingrained, it seemed almost impossible to change.
There was something in our source on the Hindu Mahasabha that really drove that point home. Back in the 1920s, they advocated for one man, one vote, which would have favored the Hindu majority
Right.
and basically reinforced the existing power structure.
It shows how deeply entrenched those caste divisions were and the challenges reformers faced. Dismantling a system that had been around for centuries, it meant tackling it on multiple fronts.
So what did they do?
Legally, they outlawed untouchability,
Right.
the practice of excluding those at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. That was a huge step towards recognizing the rights and dignity of all citizens. They also pushed for affirmative action programs to give opportunities to those who had been excluded.
So they were trying to create a level playing field, not just in theory, but in practice.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about laws. Reformers also challenged those traditional ideas about social hierarchy, trying to change mindsets and build a more inclusive society. It was a tough battle, and the fight for real equality isn't over.
It sounds like they were trying to change the very fabric of society.
Yeah. It was a time of great hope and determination, but also immense complexity. It's a story that's still unfolding today.
We've covered a lot, from land redistribution and education to fighting against the caste system. It's remarkable the scale of transformation that India went through after independence.
Yeah. And it's a story that resonates beyond India's borders. It speaks to the universal desire for justice, equality, and the power we have to shape a better future.
But we have more to uncover. Let's take a breath and then explore the world of architecture in post-independence India.
Okay, yeah, architecture. It might seem like a strange angle, but it gives us this fascinating way to understand the social and political dynamics of that time. Welcome back. We're picking up our exploration of India's social reforms after independence.
You know, I have to admit, when we started talking about architecture, I was a little lost, but now I'm actually really interested. You're saying buildings can tell us about the society they were built in.
Exactly. Architecture isn't just about how things look. It reflects and reinforces the social and political dynamics of the time. And in Mughal and post-Mughal India, these structures give us this incredible window into a society that's going through huge changes.
So how does that work? How does a building reflect social reform?
Well, let's think about Akbar, the Mughal emperor. We talked about him a bit earlier.
Right.
He was known for his religious tolerance and his vision of a more inclusive society.
Okay.
And you can see that vision reflected in his architectural projects.
Really? Oh.
He incorporated design elements from different traditions, creating this unique style that kind of symbolized his idea of a unified India, a place where different faiths could coexist, like the Buland Darwaza Gate at Fatehpur Sikri, for instance.
Oh, right, the one you mentioned before. It's a really imposing gate, isn't it? I always thought of it as a symbol of military victory.
It is, but it's more than that. The main purpose was actually to emphasize Akbar's link with the Sufi Chishti order. It was like a statement about his religious inclusivity, you know. He was using architecture to send a message of harmony.
So he was building bridges between communities, but using bricks and mortar.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of using architecture to shape a new social order, it continued after independence, though with different aims. When India was trying to establish itself as a modern nation, architecture became a way to project this new national identity.
So what kind of styles emerged? What were they going for?
There was a push towards modernism, focusing on functionality, clean lines. Think government buildings, universities, cultural institutions. They were designed to convey progress, rationality, national pride, a real break from colonial styles.
It sounds like they were creating a whole new visual language for this modern, independent India.
Exactly. Every new nation wants to create its own visual symbols, you know? And for India, architecture was a powerful way to do that. It wasn't just about the buildings themselves. It was about telling a new story.
Okay, so we've got land redistribution, education reform, efforts to get rid of the caste system, and now we're seeing how architecture played a part in shaping this new social order. It's like all these different pieces are coming together to tell a bigger story about this era of change.
And it shows that social change is a multifaceted thing. It involves changing laws, institutions, even physical spaces, and it requires vision, leadership, and a willingness to challenge how power works.
Speaking of leadership, were there any individuals who really stood out in this era of social reform?
Well, Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, he was really important. He was a big believer in social justice and felt that a modern industrialized India couldn't be built on inequality.
He was such a dominant figure.
Yeah, and he had this clear vision for India's future, one that emphasized a scientific mindset, secularism, and social equality. You can see these ideals reflected in the reforms he pushed for.
It's like he was the architect of modern India, in more ways than one.
That's a good way to put it. But he wasn't alone. There were lots of people in the government and outside of it who were dedicated to social reform. B.R. Ambedkar, for example, he was this brilliant jurist and social reformer, and he was instrumental in drafting India's constitution.
Right, the Constitution that enshrined those principles of equality and justice. That must have been a huge undertaking.
It was. And Ambedkar, he was a tireless advocate for the rights of Dalits, the people who had been marginalized by the caste system. His own experiences with discrimination really fueled his fight for social justice.
His story is inspiring. It makes you realize that change often comes from those who have experienced the problems they're fighting against firsthand.
It shows how social reform movements often gain strength from those who have the most to gain from a just and equitable society. They bring that lived experience to the table.
It makes you wonder how things would have played out without people like Ambedkar.
Yeah, while leaders like Nehru provided that overarching vision, it was the hard work and dedication of countless people on the ground that turned those aspirations into real change.
It reminds you that history isn't just made by those at the top. It's shaped by ordinary people who want a better world.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important question. What lasting impacts did these social reforms have? Did they actually achieve what they set out to do?
I imagine it's complicated. Like with land redistribution, there must have been both successes and failures.
It's not a simple story. On the one hand, there's no doubt that these reforms laid the foundation for a more just and equitable India. They gave people access to education, challenged those traditional hierarchies, and empowered millions who'd been left out.
But I'm sure it wasn't all smooth sailing. Were there unforeseen consequences?
Of course. Colonialism and those ingrained social inequalities were incredibly difficult to totally eliminate. Poverty, discrimination, social exclusion, those problems persisted, and new challenges arose.
So a step in the right direction, but a long way to go.
Exactly, and that's what makes this period so fascinating. It was a time of huge hope and ambition, but also of coming to terms with the complexities of social change.
It's like they were building the foundation, but the building itself would take generations to complete.
That's a good analogy, and it leads us to today. How are the legacies of these reforms shaping India now? What progress has been made? What challenges are left in creating a truly equitable society?
Big questions, and ones I'm eager to get into. But let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts. We'll be back soon to wrap up our deep dive into this crucial period of social change in India. We're back, ready to finish our deep dive into those social reforms in India.
Yeah, looking at how those early reforms are still impacting India today.
It's wild, right? From land redistribution and education, we went to the caste system and even architecture.
And through all that, we've seen how those reforms, though not perfect, set the stage for a more inclusive society.
It wasn't about creating a utopia overnight. It was about taking those initial steps.
Like land redistribution.
Right. The goal was to empower those landless farmers, to give them a stake in the new India.
While it wasn't always smooth, it did shift land ownership in some places.
But did it actually reduce inequality in rural India?
It's tough to say. It's a mixed bag. In some areas, it did lift people out of poverty, created a fairer system of land distribution. But it also had unintended consequences, like land fragmentation, with smaller farms that were less productive.
And I'm guessing things like corruption and political influence had an impact too.
Oh, absolutely. Good governance and transparency are crucial. You can change laws, but you need a system that makes sure they're implemented fairly.
Which brings us back to that point about how elements of British rule were actually incorporated into India's new constitution.
Right. The Indian civil service, with their focus on impartial governance, remained influential during the transition.
So they used tools of the colonial system to dismantle it.
It's a bit more nuanced than that. They adapted those tools for a new nation, which shows that change isn't always a clean break from the past.
It's like building on what you have, even if it's not ideal.
Exactly. We see a similar thing with education.
Where the goal is expanding access and giving opportunities to those who'd been excluded.
Education was seen as the key to social mobility, to empowering people.
And it's so interesting how stories like Surendranath Banerjee's really highlight that shift.
Yeah, how he was denied entry to the ICS despite being so brilliant. It shows the barriers that existed.
But he didn't let it stop him. He went on to make real change.
A great reminder that social reform often starts with those who have lived through injustice.
And then there's that constant fight against the caste system. It's like trying to unravel a knot that's been tied for centuries.
A long and difficult journey, and we're not there yet. Legal measures like outlawing untouchability were essential, but not enough on their own.
It's one thing to change laws, but changing how people think, that's a whole different challenge.
We see that in how caste-based discrimination persists. But there has been progress. Affirmative action programs have opened doors to education and jobs for marginalized communities.
Which leads to more social mobility and political representation for groups that were once silenced.
Right. It's creating a more diverse and inclusive society, though it can feel frustratingly slow.
It's like those ripples we talked about. Each act of resistance, each step towards equality, it all has a ripple effect, slowly changing the landscape.
Social change takes time. It requires patience, persistence, and that belief in a better future.
As we wrap this up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
The story of social reform in India is a testament to human agency, that we have the power to make change, to strive for a more just and equitable world.
And it's a story that's still being written. We all have a part to play.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working towards a world where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential.
This has been an amazing journey. From land reform and education to the caste system and architecture, we've seen just how complex social change can be.
We've seen how the past shapes the present, not just in India, but everywhere.
For those listening, we'll leave you with this. The pursuit of social justice is a responsibility we all share. It's a journey we have to take together, learning from history, facing the challenges of today, and striving for a more equitable future for everyone. This has been The Deep Dive.